Everything you need to know about the American Revolution's effect on Canada. The Americans failed to capture Quebec. Three-fourths of Nova Scotia's population were New Englanders, and Halifax was a major trading port and had much to lose in the war and much to gain by staying out of it. Some Nova Scotians invited George Washington to attack, but he said no. Nova Scotia eventually decided to side with Britain. Overall, 20% of people, known as the Loyalists, were in favor of British rule, and the other 80% were patriots. They would burn the Loyalist houses and farms and humiliate them in public. When the Revolution ended, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and some Loyalists took Britain's offer of farmland in Quebec. 80,000 to 100,000 people left their homes and moved to new land. Some moved to Quebec, some moved to Ontario, and some people continued on even further in search of new homes. At the time, 500,000 African Americans were in the 13 colonies. Most of those were slaves. Britain offered freedom to the slaves if they crossed the border from the 13 colonies over to Britain. Some slaves became soldiers, cooks, and they also had other jobs. In Quebec, slaves were brought by the Loyalists when they moved into Canada, but slavery was abolished in 1834. The First Nations thought that they had to pick sides during the war, either the Americans or the British. In the end, the Haudenosaunee decided to stay neutral, but Joseph Brant, who was the leader of the Mohawk tribe, decided that he should fight. He visited England as an ambassador. He secured land in Quebec for the First Nations. They just had to fight for the British during the war. But the British ended up losing the war, and the treaty ignored the First Nations. Joseph felt betrayed and sent a letter to the British, and he got land alongside the Grand River for the First Nations. The Mohawks then fought for the British in the War of 1812. Britain wanted more English-speaking colonies in Canada. The Loyalists were some of the first wave welcomed to the North. But there were smaller populations in the English colonies, and there was little unity between the French and the English. French people didn't like the British rule, and people living on the East Coast still had close economic ties with Britain. Unity was difficult, and the Dominion of Canada wasn't formed until 1867. The Loyalists created problems for the government. English and French-speaking people demanded to be governed separately, and the Constitutional Act did just that in 1791. Each government had an elected assembly, a governor, and two councils. And the elected assembly could make laws, but those laws could be vetoed by the governor or councils, a system close to the one that caused rebellion in the 13 colonies. And that's how the American Revolution changed North America and created Canada.